In the vast darkness of space where civilizations rise and fall like distant stars, there exists one universal law that even the most savage species dare not break. It transcends language, culture, and biology itself. It is written not in stone or databanks, but in the very fabric of what separates civilization from chaos. Those who heal are sacred. Those who tend the wounded are untouchable. The Red Cross, the Blue Crescent, the healing symbols of 1,000 worlds. They are shields more powerful than any armor, protected by something deeper than law or treaty. But the Kethvar had never encountered humans before. They thought they understood warfare. They believed they knew the rules. They assumed that mercy was weakness, that compassion was a flaw to be exploited. They were about to learn why across the galaxy there's an old saying whispered in the darkest corners of space: you can burn human worlds, enslave their people, even destroy their fleets, but never, ever touch their medics. The Kethvar crossed that line. This is the story of what happened next. The medical bay of the UES Compassion hummed with quiet efficiency as Dr. Sarah Chen worked over her latest patient. The young Zelani soldier's breathing was shallow, his blue-tinted skin pale from blood loss. 3 hours ago, he had been trying to kill her. Now she was trying to save his life. Pulse is stabilizing, announced Medic First Class Rodriguez, monitoring the bio-readings on his tablet. Internal bleeding has stopped. Sarah nodded, not looking up from her work. Her hands moved with practiced precision, sealing the laser burns that crisscrossed the alien's torso. Behind her, 24 other beds held a mixture of human and alien wounded, all receiving the same level of care regardless of which side they had fought for just hours earlier. The battle for Kepler 442b had been brutal. The Zelani Confederation, desperate to expand their territory, had launched a surprise attack on the human research colony. What they hadn't expected was the rapid response of the Human Medical Corps, arriving within hours of the distress signal. "Doctor," called Nurse Williams from across the bay, "we're receiving another wave of casualties. Mixed human and Zelani wounded from the surface." Sarah finally looked up, wiping sweat from her brow. At 34, she had already seen more battlefields than most career soldiers. Her brown eyes held the steady calm of someone who had learned to find peace in the midst of chaos. "How many?" 47 confirmed. More incoming. The medical bay's doors hissed open and stretchers began flowing in. Human medics worked alongside their robotic assistants, triaging the wounded with ruthless efficiency. Sarah watched as a young human Marine was placed next to a Zelani officer, both critically wounded, both receiving identical care. This was what made humans different. Sarah reflected as she moved to her next patient. Other species fought with honor, with strategy, with advanced technology. But humans had something else. They had decided long ago that some things transcended war itself. The patient before her now was a Zelani female, probably no older than 20 in human years. Her uniform marked her as a communications specialist, not a frontline soldier. A piece of shrapnel had punctured her lung, and her breathing was labored. "What's your name?" Sarah asked gently, though she knew the universal translator would convert her words into the clicking musical language of the Zelani. The alien's large, amber eyes focused on her with difficulty. "Zixara," she managed. "Well, Zixara, you're going to be fine. I'm Dr. Chen, and I'm going to take good care of you." The young Zelani looked confused. "But you are human." "I am your enemy." Sarah smiled as she prepared the surgical field. In this room, there are no enemies, only patients who need healing. As she worked, Sarah was aware of the larger battle continuing around them. The UES Compassion was a medical frigate, clearly marked with the massive red cross that designated it as a non-combatant vessel under the Geneva Convention and its galactic extensions. The ship carried minimal weapons, just enough point defense to protect against debris and small fighters that might not recognize their protected status. But protection had always been about more than just weapons. It was about the universal understanding that those who healed were sacred. Even in the darkest days of human history, medical personnel had been granted safe passage. The concept had spread as humanity ventured into space, becoming one of the foundational principles of interstellar law. "Dr. Chen?" came a voice over the intercom. It was Captain Morrison, the ship's commanding officer. "We're receiving a transmission from the Zilani fleet. They're requesting permission to retrieve their wounded." Sarah paused in her surgery. This was standard procedure. Once the immediate fighting ended, both sides typically arranged for prisoner and wounded exchanges. "Tell them they're welcome to send a medical transport. We'll transfer their people once they're stabilized." "Already done, Doc." Their medical ship should arrive within the hour. The next few hours passed in a blur of surgery, triage, and treatment. Sarah lost herself in the rhythm of saving lives, the one thing that made sense in a universe that too often seemed determined to destroy them. Human and Zilani medics worked side by side as the casualties were sorted and treated. It was Rodriguez who first noticed something was wrong. "Doctor," he said quietly, pulling Sarah aside, "the Zilani medical ship just docked, but their scan signatures are unusual." Sarah frowned. "Unusual how?" "Too many power readings. Too much armor. Medical ships don't carry that kind of defensive capability." Before Sarah could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Captain Morrison's voice echoed over the intercom, tight with controlled urgency. "All hands, battle stations. The Zilani medical vessel has opened fire. Repeat, we are under attack by a vessel flying medical colors." The medical bay shuddered as the first shots hit the Compassion's shields. Sarah grabbed a bulkhead for support, her mind reeling. In over 200 years of interstellar warfare, no species had ever attacked a medical vessel. It was unthinkable, a violation so fundamental that there weren't even protocols for dealing with it. "Doctor!" Williams called out from across the bay. "What do we do?" Sarah looked around the medical bay at the dozens of wounded, human and Zilani alike. Some were conscious, looking up at her with fear in their eyes. Others lay unconscious, dependent on the life support systems that were now flickering as power was diverted to shields and weapons. "We do what we always do," Sarah said firmly. "We save lives." Another impact rocked the ship, this one stronger. Through the medical bay's reinforced windows, Sarah could see the Zilani medical vessel, if it could even be called that. It was bristling with weapons, far more heavily armed than any true hospital ship should be. The red cross painted on its hull seemed to mock everything that symbol stood for. "Incoming transmission from the Zilani vessel," announced the ship's AI. The main screen flickered to life, showing a Zilani officer with the scarred features and aggressive posture of a warrior, not a healer. When he spoke, his translated words were cold and calculating. "Human vessel, you will surrender all Zilani personnel immediately or we will destroy you." Captain Morrison's voice came back, steady despite the circumstances. "This is a medical vessel operating under interstellar law. We are protected non-combatants. Your wounded are receiving the same care as our own." The Zilani commander's expression didn't change. "Your laws mean nothing to us. You have 60 seconds to comply." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had always believed that some things were universal, that the sanctity of medical personnel was something that transcended species and culture. She was about to learn how wrong she could be. The connection ended, and the medical bay fell into tense silence. Around her, the wounded watched with growing fear. The human personnel looked to Sarah for guidance, while the Zilani patients seemed caught between hope for rescue and horror at their rescuers' methods. "Doctor," Rodriguez said quietly, "what do we do?" Sarah looked around the bay one more time, at the faces depending on her, at the equipment keeping dozens of beings alive, at the symbol of the Red Cross that adorned her uniform. She thought about the oath she had taken, the promise to do no harm, to heal rather than hurt. "We do our jobs," she said simply. "Whatever happens, we keep saving lives." The countdown timer on the screen reached 0. The first torpedo struck the medical bay directly. The explosion tore through the reinforced hull like paper, sending shrapnel and debris flying across the room. Emergency force fields snapped into place, barely containing the atmosphere as half the bay was suddenly exposed to space. Alarms screamed. Emergency lights bathed everything in red, and the artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. Sarah found herself on the floor, her ears ringing, blood flowing from a cut on her forehead. Around her, the medical bay was in chaos. Some of the wounded had been thrown from their beds, while others were trapped under fallen equipment. The carefully organized sanctuary of healing had become a scene of destruction in seconds. But even as she struggled to her feet, Sarah's training took over. The wounded came first. Everything else was secondary. "Rodriguez! Williams!" "Sound off," she called out, pulling debris off a trapped Zelani patient. "Here, Doc," came Rodriguez's voice from across the bay. "I'm okay." "Williams is unconscious but breathing," reported another medic. "I've got her." Sarah looked up at the massive hole torn in the hull, held back only by the emergency force field. Through it, she could see the Zelani vessel moving closer, weapons charging for another strike. They weren't trying to disable the ship, they were trying to destroy it entirely. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a violation of medical neutrality. This was systematic murder, the deliberate targeting of healers and wounded alike. It was a line that no civilization in recorded history had ever crossed. The Zelani had just declared war not just on humanity, but on the very concept of mercy itself. As secondary explosions rocked the ship and the lights flickered ominously, Sarah Chen made a decision that would echo across the galaxy. She activated her emergency beacon, the one that would broadcast not just a distress signal, but a record of what was happening here. "This is Sarah Chen aboard the UES Compassion," she said into her communicator, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "We are a medical vessel operating under interstellar law. We have been attacked while treating wounded from both sides. The Zelani Confederation has fired on a hospital ship. They have crossed a line that should never be crossed." She looked around the destroyed medical bay at her staff still working to save lives even as their own ship died around them, at the wounded who looked to them for salvation. "If anyone receives this message, know this. We held to our oath until the end. We saved who we could. We did no harm, remember, us not for how we died, but for how we lived." The second torpedo strike tore through the ship's main power core. As the UES Compassion died in the cold vacuum of space, taking with it over 200 souls, healers and wounded, human and alien alike, the emergency beacon continued broadcasting its message into the darkness. Across human space, that message was received, recorded, analyzed, and something fundamental changed in the human psyche. The Zelani Confederation had just learned that there are some lines that, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. Some acts that, once committed, change everything that comes after. They had attacked human medics. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. Admiral Marcus Kane was in his quarters aboard the UES Retribution when the message arrived. He had been reviewing tactical reports from the Kepler 442b engagement, trying to understand how a simple colonial defense had turned into such a bloody affair. The Zelani attack had been more aggressive than usual, more desperate. The priority alert chimed on his personal terminal, displaying the emergency beacon data from the Compassion. Kane had been expecting casualty reports. Medical ships always took wounded in during major engagements. What he wasn't expecting was to watch his entire worldview crumble in the space of a 4-minute recording. Kane was a career military man. 53 years old, gray-haired, and stern-faced, he had commanded fleets in 3 major conflicts. He understood war in all its terrible necessity. He had seen cities burned, worlds blockaded, entire species brought to their knees. But what he watched on that recording was something else entirely. The transmission began with Dr. Chen's calm professional voice reporting the attack. Kane watched as the medical bay, clearly marked, obviously non-combatant, was systematically destroyed. He saw human and Zelani medics working side by side to save lives even as weapons fire tore through their ship. He witnessed the moment when the concept of medical neutrality, one of the oldest and most sacred laws of warfare, died in the cold vacuum of space. Kane watched the recording 3 times before he fully accepted what he was seeing. Then he forwarded it to every ship captain in his fleet along with a single message: emergency fleet meeting in 1 hour. All senior staff. Within minutes, his communication board was lighting up with incoming calls from his captains. Kane ignored them all. He needed time to think, to process what this meant for everything that came next. He had known Dr. Sarah Chen personally. She had served aboard his flagship during the Proxima campaign, had saved the lives of dozens of his crew members. She was exactly the kind of person who would keep working to save enemy wounded even as her own ship was being destroyed around her. The kind of person who represented the best of what humanity could be. The Zilani had murdered her for showing mercy. The fleet meeting convened in the Retribution's main briefing room. Kane looked out at the faces of his senior officers, men and women who had served with him through countless battles. They all had the same expression of stunned disbelief that Kane recognized from his own mirror. "You've all seen the recording," Kane began without preamble. "I want to hear your thoughts." Captain Sarah Torres of the UES Vigilance spoke first. "Admiral, in my 20-year career, I have never seen anything like this. Medical neutrality isn't just military doctrine, it's the foundation of civilized warfare. The Zilani have always been aggressive," added Captain Chen Wei of the destroyer UES Shanghai. "But this is something else. This is deliberate barbarism." Kane nodded grimly. "The question is, what do we do about it?" The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implications. This wasn't just about one destroyed medical ship, tragic as that was. This was about the complete breakdown of the most fundamental rule of interstellar warfare. If medical personnel could be targeted, if the Red Cross meant nothing, then everything changed. "Sir," spoke up Commander Lisa Park, Kane's tactical officer, "I've been analyzing the attack pattern. The Zilani vessel specifically targeted the medical bay first. This wasn't random destruction. It was calculated murder." Kane pulled up the tactical analysis on the main screen. The Zilani ship's weapons had been precisely aimed, striking the medical facilities while avoiding the engine room and command deck. They had wanted to kill the wounded and their caregivers while keeping the ship intact for capture. "They used a ship disguised as a medical vessel," Kane continued, "flying false colors, violating every treaty and convention that governs interstellar warfare. They didn't just cross a line, they obliterated it." The door to the briefing room chimed, and Kane's communication officer entered. "Admiral, priority message from Fleet Command." Kane accepted the data pad, scanning its contents quickly. His expression grew darker with each line. "Fleet Command has received similar reports from 3 other sectors," he announced to the room. The Compassion wasn't an isolated incident. The Zilani have systematically targeted medical personnel across multiple star systems. 22 hospital ships attacked in the past week. Over 3,000 medical personnel killed. The silence in the room was deafening. Kane could see the shock in his officers' faces slowly transforming into something else. Something harder and more dangerous. "What are our orders, sir?" asked Torres quietly. Kane set down the data pad and looked at each of his officers in turn. These were good people, professional soldiers who understood the rules of warfare and tried to fight honorably even in the midst of chaos. But the Zilani had just changed those rules forever. "Fleet Command is implementing Protocol 7, Kane said. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Protocol 7. None of them had ever expected to hear those words in their lifetimes. It was the human military's most extreme authorization, reserved for threats that went beyond simple warfare to attack the fundamental principles of civilization itself. "Sir," Commander Park said carefully, "Protocol 7 means total war," Kane finished. "No restraint, no mercy. The complete destruction of the Zilani Confederation's ability to wage war." Captain Wei leaned forward in his chair. "Admiral, with respect, that's genocide. The complete destruction of an entire civilization." Kane was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Dr. Chen's final message, of the medics who had died trying to heal rather than harm, of the wounded of both species who had been murdered in their beds. The Zelani made their choice when they decided that mercy was weakness, he said finally. They declared war on the very concept of medical neutrality. They murdered healers who were trying to save their own people. He stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars where, even now, more medical ships were being targeted and destroyed. But Protocol 7 doesn't mean genocide, Captain. It means that we fight without the restraints that civilized species impose on warfare. No more protected targets, no more medical neutrality. No more mercy for those who have shown they understand only strength. The implications hung heavy in the air. For over 2 centuries, human warfare had been governed by strict rules of engagement designed to minimize civilian casualties and preserve medical neutrality. Those rules had made human forces predictable, had given their enemies sanctuaries they could count on being respected. The Zelani had just eliminated those sanctuaries forever. "Orders, sir?" Torres asked. Kane turned back to his officers, his expression grim but resolute. "We're going to show the Zelani what human warfare looks like when we stop playing by the rules they've chosen to ignore. Signal all ships. Full mobilization. All medical vessels are to be recalled and refitted for combat operations." "The hospital ships, sir?" Park asked, her voice uncertain. "Will be converted to assault vessels. If the Zelani want to target medical facilities, then there won't be any medical facilities left to target. Our medics will serve on combat vessels from now on." Kane began pacing the briefing room, his mind already working through the tactical implications. "Send word to Fleet Command. We need authorization to begin Operation Mercy's End." The name caused several officers to look up sharply. They had all heard rumors of Operation Mercy's End, the theoretical response plan for exactly this situation. Most had assumed it was just a contingency that would never be implemented. "What does that entail, sir?" asked Torres. Kane's smile was cold and terrible. "The Zelani think they understand warfare? They think that by targeting our medics, they've found our weakness. They're about to learn what our medics were protecting them from." He activated the fleet communication system, his voice carrying to every ship in the battle group. "All vessels, this is Admiral Kane. As of this moment, we are operating under Protocol 7. The Zelani Confederation has chosen to wage war against the fundamental principles of civilization itself. They have murdered medical personnel, targeted hospital ships, and shown complete disregard for the rules that separate warfare from butchery." Kane paused, letting his words sink in across the fleet. The era of restrained warfare is over. The Zelani wanted to see human warfare without mercy? They're about to get their wish. All ships prepare for immediate hyperspace jump to Zelani space. We have a war to finish. As the Retribution's engines began spinning up for the jump to hyperspace, Kane remained at the viewport watching the stars. Somewhere out there, the Zelani leadership was probably celebrating their tactical victory, pleased with their success in eliminating human medical assets. They had no idea what was coming for them. In medical facilities across human space, the news of the Compassion's destruction was spreading like wildfire. Dr. James Morrison at New Geneva Medical Center stopped his surgery when the alert came through. Dr. Amanda Singh aboard the medical station at Alpha Centauri watched the recording 3 times before she could accept what she was seeing. But it wasn't just the medical personnel who were reacting. The attack on the Compassion was being broadcast on every news network in human space. The image of Dr. Chen's final message was being shared across billions of communication channels. Humanity was watching their healers die, and something primal was awakening in response. On Earth, the Global Medical Assembly held an emergency session. Representatives from every medical organization in human space attended virtually, their faces grim as they watched the recordings from Kepler 442b. "The Zelani have declared war on medicine itself," announced Dr. Brennan. Elena Vasquez, the Assembly's president. "They have targeted those who have sworn to do no harm, who have dedicated their lives to healing rather than hurting." The Assembly's vote was unanimous, full support for any military action taken in response to the attacks. For the first time in their history, the medical community was endorsing unrestricted warfare. But the real change was happening at the grassroots level. In hospitals and clinics across human space, medical personnel were volunteering for military service, not as combat medics, which they had always done, but as active combatants. They wanted to fight back against those who had murdered their colleagues. The Hippocratic Oath had always bound them to do no harm. But what about doing harm to those who targeted healers? Dr. Michael Torres, a trauma surgeon on Mars, summed up the feelings of many when he posted a message on the medical networks. They think we're weak because we heal rather than hurt. They think our compassion makes us vulnerable. They're about to learn that we know anatomy better than anyone. We know exactly how to cause the maximum amount of damage. Within hours of the Compassion's destruction, medical personnel across human space were requesting transfer to combat units. They weren't abandoning their medical duties, they were expanding them to include the surgical removal of those who threatened other healers. The psychological impact was spreading beyond just medical personnel. Ordinary civilians, soldiers, administrators, everyone was processing what it meant that the Zelani had targeted those whose only crime was showing mercy. On the colony world of New Hippocrates, where the first interstellar medical school had been established, protesters gathered outside the Zelani embassy. Their signs read, "They killed our healers," and "Medicine is sacred." But these weren't ordinary protests. The crowd was silent, grim, filled with a cold anger that was more frightening than any riot. The Zelani ambassador, Kethnali, watched from her office window as the crowd grew larger. She had been expecting outrage, had prepared statements about the necessities of war and the weakness of human medical policy. What she saw in the faces below was something else entirely. It was the look of a species that had just discovered something terrible about itself. By the end of the first day after the Compassion's destruction, every major news network in human space was running the same story. Medical personnel murdered while trying to heal. Hospital ships destroyed while flying protected colors. The fundamental laws of warfare abandoned in favor of calculated barbarism. But more than that, they were running stories about the human response. The unprecedented mobilization of medical personnel for combat roles, the conversion of hospital ships to assault vessels, the implementation of Protocol 7 for the first time in human history. The Zelani had thought they were eliminating human medical capability. Instead, they had eliminated human medical restraint, and in the depths of space, Admiral Kane's fleet made the jump to hyperspace, carrying with them a new kind of war. A war without mercy, without restraint, without the protection that medicine had always provided to the wounded. The Zelani were about to learn why, throughout human history, healers had been protected not just by law, but by the understanding that they were all that stood between civilization and something far darker. They had killed the healers. Now they would meet what the healers had been protecting them from. The first Zelani system to experience humanity's new approach to warfare was Kethra Prime, a border world that served as a major military logistics hub. The system's defenders had been expecting a conventional human assault, methodical, precise, with careful attention to minimizing civilian casualties and protecting non-combatant infrastructure. What arrived instead was something from their nightmares. Admiral Kane's fleet dropped out of hyperspace not at the system's edge as military doctrine dictated, but directly in orbit of Kethra Prime itself. The tactical computers of the Zelani Defense Fleet immediately flagged this as impossible. No military force would risk their ships in a planetary gravity well unless they had overwhelming superiority. But more than that, they were operating under completely different rules now. All Zelani vessels, came Admiral Kane's broadcast on all frequencies, his voice calm and professional. This is Admiral Marcus Kane of the Human Expeditionary Fleet. You have 60 seconds to surrender unconditionally, or we will demonstrate what human warfare looks like without medical restraint. General Vextar, commander of the Kethra Prime Defense Force, stared at the tactical display in disbelief. The human fleet was massive, over 200 vessels including ships that his sensors couldn't even classify. But it was the formation that confused him most. The humans weren't spreading out for optimal weapons coverage. Instead, they were clustering together in what looked like a medical evacuation pattern. "What are they doing?" he asked his tactical officer. "Unknown, sir." Their formation makes no tactical sense unless—" The officer paused, his face paling. "Sir, those converted medical ships aren't carrying wounded. They're carrying weapons. Weapons designed by people who understand anatomy." On the bridge of the Retribution, Admiral Kane watched the countdown timer reach 0. The Zilani had not surrendered. He had not expected them to. "All ships," he announced calmly, "implement Protocol 7. Show them what mercy was protecting them from." The first wave of the attack wasn't conventional weapons fire. Instead, it was something far more insidious. A cloud of microscopic nanobots released from the converted medical ships. These weren't designed to destroy equipment or infrastructure. They were designed by human doctors who understood biological systems better than anyone in the galaxy. The nanobots sought out Zilani life signs specifically, designed to interact with their unique biochemistry. But instead of healing, they carried payloads that Dr. Wessner, Amanda Singh and her team had developed during their 10-hour crash course in applied combat medicine. The Zilani respiratory system has a unique vulnerability, Dr. Singh had explained to Admiral Kane during the fleet's hyperspace transit. Their oxygen processing is incredibly efficient, but it relies on a specific enzyme that can be disrupted. Not fatally. We're not monsters. But it will cause severe respiratory distress, making it impossible for them to function in combat. Kane had nodded grimly. Non-lethal, but completely incapacitating. Exactly. They want to target our medics? Fine. They can learn what happens when medics stop trying to heal and start applying their knowledge of anatomy for other purposes. Now, as the nanobots spread through the Zilani fleet, Kane watched the tactical display with cold satisfaction. One by one, the enemy ships began to drift, their crews incapacitated by respiratory distress. Not dead, human medical personnel had insisted on that, but completely unable to fight. But the nanobots were just the beginning. The second wave of the attack came from weapons that no military mind would have conceived, but which made perfect sense to someone who understood how biological systems functioned. Sonic frequencies calibrated to the Zilani inner ear structure, causing severe vertigo and disorientation. Electromagnetic pulses tuned to their nervous system's bioelectric patterns, inducing temporary paralysis. Every weapon had been designed not by military engineers, but by human medical personnel who had spent their careers learning how to heal Zilani physiology. They knew exactly which systems to target, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly how to render their enemy completely helpless without crossing the line into permanent harm. "It's surgical," Admiral Kane murmured as he watched the Zilani defense fleet completely neutralized within minutes. "They've turned healing into warfare." On the planet's surface, the Zilani military installations were experiencing their own version of this new type of warfare. Drop pods were landing across the planet, but instead of carrying standard marine assault teams, they carried former medical personnel armed with weapons that seemed to defy military logic. Dr. Michael Torres, the Mars trauma surgeon who had requested combat assignment, led one of the assault teams through a Zilani military compound. His team moved with the precise efficiency of an operating room, each member knowing exactly what their role was and how to execute it. "Remember," Torres said into his communicator as they approached the main command center, "we're not here to kill. We're here to demonstrate what medical knowledge looks like when it's applied tactically." The Zilani guards at the command center found themselves facing something completely outside their military training. The humans didn't charge with weapons blazing. Instead, they deployed devices that seemed almost like medical equipment, scanners that mapped the defenders' biological signatures, then targeted them with precision that was surgical in its accuracy. Within minutes, every Zilani in the compound was unconscious, their nervous systems temporarily disrupted by electromagnetic fields calibrated specifically to their species' biology. They would wake up in a few hours with nothing more than a headache, but for now, they were completely helpless. "This is wrong," whispered Lieutenant Kethnari as she watched the humans secure the compound with clinical efficiency. She was one of the few Zilani who remained conscious, protected by the command center's shielding. "This isn't how warfare is supposed to work." But Torres heard her through the communication system and responded, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a surgeon. You're right, this isn't how warfare is supposed to work. Medical personnel are supposed to be protected. Hospitals are supposed to be sacred. The wounded are supposed to be safe. He paused, looking directly at the camera that was broadcasting his words to the remaining Zilani defenders. You changed those rules when you murdered Dr. Sarah Chen and everyone aboard the Compassion. You decided that mercy was weakness, that healing was vulnerability. So now you get to learn what we were protecting you from. The systematic conquest of Kethra Prime continued for 6 hours. Not a single human life was lost. Not a single Zilani was permanently harmed, but an entire star system's military capability was completely neutralized by former medical personnel who had applied their knowledge of anatomy and biology to the art of war. The psychological impact was devastating. General Vexstar, recovered enough to speak after his exposure to the nanobots, found himself in the unusual position of being interrogated by a pediatric surgeon from Earth. Dr. Lisa Park had volunteered for combat duty after watching the recording of the Compassion's destruction, and her bedside manner had translated surprisingly well to interrogation work. You know what the interesting thing is? Dr. Park said conversationally as she reviewed the medical scan she had just taken of the general. Your species has a fascinating stress response. When you're truly terrified, your cardiovascular system produces a specific hormone signature. It's completely unique to situations where you feel genuinely helpless. She showed him the readout on her scanner, her voice remaining as calm as if she were discussing a routine checkup. According to this, you're more frightened right now than you've ever been in your life. More than when you were in combat, more than when you were wounded, more than when you thought you were going to die. Do you know why that is? General Vexstar said nothing, but his breathing was shallow and his skin had taken on a pale, bluish tinge that indicated extreme stress in his species. It's because you've realized that everything you thought you knew about humans was wrong, Dr. Park continued. You thought we were weak because we showed mercy. You thought our medical personnel were vulnerable targets. You never considered that they might be the most dangerous humans of all. She leaned forward slightly, her expression still professionally calm. We know your biology better than you do. We understand your physiology, your psychology, your nervous system, your cardiovascular responses. We've spent centuries learning how to heal your people. That same knowledge can be applied in other ways. The general's stress hormones spiked even higher. But here's what you really don't understand, Dr. Park said, standing and preparing to leave. We're not doing this because we're cruel. We're doing this because mercy requires protection. Medical neutrality only works when both sides respect it. You chose not to respect it. She paused at the door. The humans you're going to be dealing with from now on aren't the same ones you've been fighting for the past year. Those humans were restrained by their medical personnel, guided by people who took an oath to do no harm. You killed those people. You removed that restraint. Now you get to face humans without medical oversight. General Vexstar watched her leave, and for the first time in his military career, he understood what true fear felt like. The news of Kethra Prime's conquest spread through Zilani space like wildfire. A major military installation defended by their best troops conquered in 6 hours without a single human casualty. Worse, conquered by medical personnel using weapons and tactics that no military mind had ever conceived. On the Zilani homeworld, Supreme Commander Thexawani convened an emergency session of the Military Council. The recordings from Kethra Prime were playing on the main screen, showing human former medics moving through their installations with surgical precision.
"This is not possible," insisted General Kethvar, the same officer who had ordered the attack on the Compassion.
Medical personnel are not warriors. They lack the mindset for warfare. Apparently not, replied Admiral Vexnala grimly. According to our intelligence reports, over 60% of human medical personnel have volunteered for combat roles in the past week. They're calling it applied anatomy. Commander Thexani studied the tactical reports with growing unease. The human assault on Kethra Prime hadn't followed any known military doctrine. Instead, it had resembled nothing so much as a massive medical procedure. with each human unit working in perfect coordination to achieve a specific biological outcome. "Sir," interrupted the intelligence officer, "we're receiving reports from 3 more border systems. Human fleets have arrived, broadcasting the same message. 60 seconds to surrender, or they'll demonstrate warfare without medical restraint." Thexani felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And?" "All 3 systems surrendered immediately, sir, without firing a shot." The implications hung heavy in the air. The Zelani Confederation had built its military doctrine around the assumption that humans would fight according to predictable patterns. Limited by their concern for casualties and their adherence to medical neutrality, those assumptions had just become not merely wrong, but catastrophically dangerous. "What are our options?" Thexani asked quietly. The silence in the room was telling. Finally, Admiral Vexnala spoke up. "We could attempt to negotiate a return to the previous rules of engagement, offer to respect medical neutrality in exchange for human restraint." "After we specifically targeted their medical personnel?" General Kethvar scoffed. "They'll never trust us to honor such an agreement." "Then what do you suggest?" Thexani snapped. Kethvar's expression was grim. "We fight. We adapt to their new tactics. We show them that the Zelani are not so easily conquered, even by their medical warriors." But even as he spoke, Kethvar knew he was whistling in the dark. The reports from Kethra Prime made it clear that the humans weren't just using different tactics. They were using a completely different understanding of warfare itself. They were fighting with the precision of surgeons and the knowledge of healers turned to destructive purpose. How do you fight someone who knows your biology better than you do? How do you resist an enemy who can incapacitate your forces without even killing them? How do you maintain morale when your soldiers know that the enemy can reach inside their very biology and shut them down at will? The Zelani military machine was designed to fight wars. It had no framework for dealing with medical assault. As the meeting broke up and the commanders returned to their forces, Supreme Commander Thexani remained in his office, staring at the tactical displays. The human fleets were moving deeper into Zelani space, and every system they approached was surrendering without resistance. The Zelani had thought they were fighting a war. They were discovering that they had instead unleashed something far more dangerous: human medical knowledge applied with surgical precision and the complete absence of mercy. Dr. Sarah Chen's final message played on his screen once more. "Remember us not for how we died, but for how we lived." Thexani was beginning to understand that the humans were remembering both. They were honoring their fallen healers by becoming something that their enemies would never forget. The Zelani had crossed a line. Now they were learning what existed on the other side of it, and in the depths of space, more human fleets were jumping to hyperspace, carrying with them medical personnel who had sworn an oath to do no harm. They were keeping that oath. They weren't killing the Zelani. They were just making them wish they had never touched a human medic. 2 weeks after the destruction of the UES Compassion, the Zelani Confederation controlled less than 30% of its original territory. The human advance had been relentless, surgical, and completely unstoppable. World after world had surrendered rather than face what the media had begun calling the medic offensive. Dr. Amanda Singh stood on the bridge of what had once been the UES Healing Hand, now renamed the UES Surgical Strike. The medical frigate had been converted to a weapons platform, its healing bays replaced with laboratories where former medical personnel developed new ways to apply their anatomical knowledge to warfare. "Dr. Singh," reported her tactical officer, a former emergency room nurse named Patterson, "we're receiving surrender broadcasts from the Kethnex system. All 3 planets are offering unconditional capitulation." Singh nodded, making a note on her tablet. That was the 7th system to surrender without resistance in the past 3 days. Word of what had happened at Kethra Prime had spread throughout Zelani space, and military commanders were choosing capitulation over facing human medical warfare. "Any word from Admiral Kane's fleet?" Singh asked. "They've reached the outer defense perimeter of the Zelani homeworld system. The entire Zelani Grand Fleet is massed there, over 400 vessels." Singh smiled grimly. The Zelani were finally going to make a stand. Good. The human medical community had been looking forward to demonstrating the full scope of their capabilities. On the bridge of the Retribution, Admiral Kane studied the tactical displays showing the Zelani defensive formation. It was impressive, the largest concentration of military force the Confederation had ever assembled. Under normal circumstances, it would have been enough to give any attacking fleet serious pause. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Admiral," reported his intelligence officer, "we're receiving a transmission from Supreme Commander Texani himself." The main screen flickered to life, showing the Zelani leader in his command center. Texani looked older than Kane remembered from their previous encounters, his skin showing the stress patterns typical of his species when under extreme pressure. "Admiral Kane," Texani began, his translated voice carrying notes of desperation despite his attempt at dignity. "I request a parley. There are things that must be discussed before any further hostilities." Kane considered the request. Protocol 7 didn't technically forbid negotiations, though it did eliminate most of the usual constraints on how those negotiations could be conducted. "Very well, Supreme Commander. You have 10 minutes. Texani's relief was visible. "Admiral, the Confederation is prepared to offer significant concessions. We will respect medical neutrality going forward. We will pay reparations for the destruction of your medical vessels. We will even withdraw from the disputed border systems." Kane listened impassively. Behind him on the bridge, several of his officers, many of them former medical personnel, watched with expressions of cold interest. "Is that all?" Kane asked when Texani finished. The Zelani leader looked confused. "Admiral, these are substantial concessions, more than generous compensation for..." "For what?" Kane interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "For murdering medical personnel? For destroying hospital ships? For targeting healers who are trying to save your own people?" Texani's skin shifted to a pale blue, indicating extreme discomfort. "Admiral, war involves tragic necessities. Regrettable actions that..." "No!" Kane cut him off again. "War involves military targets engaging other military targets. What you did was murder. Systematic, calculated murder of non-combatants whose only crime was showing mercy." Kane stood, his expression grim. "You seem to think this is about territory or resources or strategic advantage. It's not. This is about the fact that you attacked the fundamental principle that separates civilization from barbarism." He gestured to the tactical display showing the massed Zelani fleet. "You've assembled your grand fleet to protect your homeworld. 400 ships, your best commanders, your most advanced weapons. Do you know what you're really protecting them from?" Texani said nothing, but his stress indicators were spiking. "You're protecting them from human medics," Kane continued. "Doctors and nurses and surgeons who have spent their careers learning how to heal. People who took an oath to do no harm, who dedicated their lives to saving others." Kane's smile was terrifying in its complete lack of warmth. "You killed those people. You murdered healers, and now you get to face what they were protecting you from. Humans who understand your biology, your anatomy, your physiology, and who are no longer bound by any oath to use that knowledge gently." The transmission ended abruptly. Kane turned to his fleet communications officer. "Signal all ships. Begin the final demonstration." What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations as the most one-sided engagement in recorded history. The human fleet didn't advance in the traditional sense. Instead, they deployed what looked like a massive medical operation. Ships moved into formation with the precision of a surgical team, each one taking a specific position designed to maximize the effectiveness of their converted medical technology. The first wave of the attack was something the Zelani had never encountered before: targeted biological warfare delivered with medical precision. The converted hospital ships released clouds of nanobots programmed with the complete genetic profile of every Zelani crew member aboard the defending fleet. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, former pediatric specialist and now the fleet's chief biological warfare officer, monitored the nanobots' progress from her command station aboard the former medical research vessel UES Gentle Care. "Nanobots are interfacing with Zelani nervous systems," she reported clinically. inducing controlled seizures that will result in temporary paralysis lasting approximately 6 hours. No permanent damage, but complete incapacitation. It was like watching a medical procedure on a massive scale. One by one, the ships of the Zilani Grand Fleet began to drift as their crews succumbed to the precisely calibrated biological attack. Not dead, not permanently harmed, but completely unable to function. But the nanobots were just the opening gambit. The second phase involved something that Dr. Marcus Reed, a former trauma surgeon, had spent weeks perfecting: targeted psychological warfare based on deep understanding of Zilani neurology. Implementing fear response amplification, Dr. Reed reported from his station aboard the converted ambulance ship UES Last Resort, broadcasting frequencies that will trigger maximum stress responses in Zilani neural patterns. The remaining conscious Zilani crew members found themselves experiencing terror beyond anything they had ever imagined. The human medical personnel had identified the exact frequencies that would trigger their species' most primal fear responses, then amplified those signals across their entire fleet. Within minutes, ships that hadn't been directly affected by the nanobots were surrendering anyway, their crews too paralyzed by artificially induced panic to continue fighting. But it was the third phase that truly demonstrated what human medical knowledge could accomplish when turned to warfare. Dr. Sarah Kim, a former neurologist, had developed what she called empathy induction. Using precisely calibrated electromagnetic fields, her team could temporarily alter Zilani brain chemistry to force them to experience the emotional states of their victims. "Beginning empathy protocol," Dr. Kim announced. "Every conscious Zilani in the fleet will now experience the fear, pain, and despair felt by the medical personnel they murdered." The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the Zilani fleet, crew members who had never questioned the attack on the Compassion suddenly found themselves experiencing the terror of Dr. Sarah Chen and her staff as their medical bay was destroyed around them. They felt the helplessness of wounded patients as they were murdered in their beds. They experienced the grief of medical personnel watching their colleagues die for the crime of showing mercy. Supreme Commander Thexani, monitoring the battle from his command ship, watched his grand fleet dissolve before his eyes. Not destroyed in the traditional sense, most of the ships were intact and their crews were alive. But they were completely incapacitated, their personnel either unconscious, paralyzed by fear, or overwhelmed by emotions they had never been designed to process. "Sir," his communication officer reported, her voice shaking, "we're receiving surrender messages from every ship in the fleet. They're begging us to make it stop." Thexani stared at the tactical display in horror. The humans hadn't fired a single traditional weapon. They hadn't destroyed any ships or killed any personnel, but they had systematically neutralized the largest fleet in Zilani history using nothing but applied medical knowledge. "Admiral Kane," he said into the communication system, his voice barely above a whisper, "I surrender. The Confederation surrenders. Please, make it stop." The response came immediately. "Acknowledged. All biological and psychological warfare effects will cease in 60 seconds. True to their word, the human medical personnel began shutting down their systems. The nanobots completed their programmed life cycles and became inert. The fear-inducing frequencies stopped broadcasting. The empathy induction fields powered down. Across the Zilani fleet, crew members slowly began to recover their faculties. But the psychological impact of what they had experienced would last much longer than the temporary physical effects. Admiral Kane's voice echoed across all frequencies as he addressed the defeated Zilani fleet. "This is Admiral Marcus Kane to all Zilani personnel. Your military forces have been neutralized. Your grand fleet has surrendered. But I want you to understand something important about what just happened here." Kane paused, looking around his bridge at the former medical personnel who had helped accomplish this unprecedented victory. Every human who participated in this engagement was once a healer. They were doctors, nurses, surgeons, medics. They could have used their knowledge to kill you all easily. Instead, they chose to demonstrate their capabilities while causing no permanent harm. He let that sink in for a moment. Do you understand what that means? It means that even now, Even after you murdered our healers and destroyed our medical ships, we still refuse to abandon our principles entirely. We will defend medical neutrality with overwhelming force, but we will not become the monsters that you chose to become. Dr. Singh, listening from the bridge of the surgical strike, felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sorrow. They had won decisively, had demonstrated beyond any doubt that attacking human medical personnel was a mistake no species would ever make twice. But the victory felt hollow somehow, purchased with the abandonment of the very principles they were trying to protect. Dr. Ring's Kipnos, Singh, her communication officer, reported, "We're receiving a priority message from the Zalani medical frigate Healing Dawn. They're requesting permission to begin treating their own wounded." Singh considered the request. The Zalani medical ship had remained non-combatant throughout the engagement, adhering to proper medical neutrality protocols. Their medical personnel had played no role in the attacks on human medical facilities. "Permission granted," she said finally, "and offer them any assistance they need. Medical personnel shouldn't have to suffer for the crimes of their military." It was a small gesture, but an important one. Even in the midst of this new type of warfare, some principles remained sacred. On the bridge of the Healing Dawn, Dr. Keth Sara, the Zalani chief medical officer, received the human response with surprise and gratitude. She had expected the humans to refuse to extend their biological warfare to medical personnel as her own military had done. Instead, they were offering help. "This is Dr. Keth Sara to all human medical vessels," she broadcast. I want to apologize. What was done to your people, to Dr. Chen and the crew of the Compassion, it was wrong. Medical neutrality is sacred to us as well. We should have stopped it." The response came from Dr. Singh herself. "Apology accepted, Doctor. Medical personnel must stand together regardless of species. We've learned what happens when we don't." As the two medical fleets began coordinating their efforts to treat the casualties of the engagement, casualties that were entirely psychological and temporary, but casualties nonetheless, a new understanding began to emerge. The Zalani had learned that attacking medical personnel was a mistake that could destroy entire civilizations. But the humans had learned something equally important, that abandoning medical principles even in response to the most extreme provocations came with its own costs. The war was effectively over. The Zalani Confederation would never again pose a threat to human medical personnel or any other healers in the galaxy. But the real victory wasn't in the battlefield. It was in the decision to remain healers even while waging war. As Admiral Kane's fleet began the journey back to human space, carrying with it the unconditional surrender of the Zalani Confederation, the former medical personnel aboard those ships began to contemplate their return to their original calling. They had proven that human compassion was not weakness. They had demonstrated that mercy required protection. They had shown the galaxy what happened to those who targeted healers. Now they had to decide what it meant to be healers in a universe that had seen what healers could become when their patients were threatened. Dr. Sarah Chen's final message echoed in their minds. "Remember us not for how we died, but for how we lived." The Zalani had learned about how Dr. Chen died. Now it was time for the galaxy to remember how she lived. 6 months after the surrender of the Zalani Confederation, Dr. Amanda Singh stood in the memorial garden aboard the newly commissioned UES Sarah Chen Memorial Hospital. The medical station orbited the former battle site of Kepler 442b, where the Compassion had been destroyed, and everything had changed. The garden was peaceful, filled with plants from dozens of worlds, human, Zalani, and species from across the galaxy who had contributed to the memorial. At its center stood a simple monument bearing the names of every medical personnel killed during the Zalani attacks, with Dr. Sarah Chen's name at the top. "Penny for your thoughts?" came a familiar voice behind her. Singh turned to see Admiral Kane, though he looked different now. The hard lines of military command had softened somewhat, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. He was wearing civilian clothes. He had resigned his commission 3 months ago to help establish the new Galactic Medical Protection Corps. Just thinking about how much has changed, Singh replied, gesturing to the memorial. 6 months ago, we were doctors and nurses and medics. Now what exactly are we? Kane joined her in contemplating the monument. We're what we always were. Healers, we just had to learn a harder way to practice medicine. The aftermath of what historians were already calling the Medic War had been complicated. The Zelani Confederation had surrendered unconditionally, but the implications of what human medical personnel had accomplished went far beyond one species' defeat. For the first time in galactic history, medical knowledge had been weaponized on a massive scale. The precision with which human former medics had neutralized the Zelani military had demonstrated capabilities that every species in the galaxy was still trying to understand. But perhaps more importantly, it had established a precedent that would reshape interstellar warfare forever. The Galactic Council's new protocols are being ratified today, Kane mentioned, checking his tablet. Universal medical neutrality backed by enforcement provisions that make our response to the Zelani look restrained. Singh nodded. She had helped draft those protocols during the lengthy negotiations that had followed the Zelani surrender. The document was comprehensive, establishing not just the protection of medical personnel, but the active enforcement of that protection by any and all member species. The message was clear: attack medical personnel anywhere in the galaxy. The Zelani had inadvertently united the galaxy behind a principle that had previously been honored more in theory than in practice. Dr. Singh, came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Dr. Kethsara, the Zelani medical officer from the Healing Dawn. Over the past 6 months, she had become an unlikely ally in the efforts to establish the new medical protection protocols. Dr. Kethsara, Singh replied warmly. How are the rehabilitation programs progressing? The Zelani physician's expression was complex, gratitude mixed with lingering shame. Better than expected. The psychological trauma from the empathy induction has actually helped many of our military personnel understand the impact of their actions. We've had over 3,000 requests for transfer to medical service. It was an unexpected consequence of the human medical assault. The Zelani military personnel who had experienced the fear and despair of their victims had been fundamentally changed by the experience. Many had abandoned military service entirely, choosing instead to dedicate themselves to healing. There's something else, Dr. Kathsara continued. Supreme Commander Thexani has requested a personal meeting with you, Dr. Singh. He's been working on something he wants to show you. Singh exchanged a glance with Kane. The former Zelani military leader had been surprisingly cooperative during the surrender negotiations, but this was the first time he had requested a direct meeting with any of the human medical personnel. 2 hours later, Singh found herself in a small conference room aboard the Zelani diplomatic vessel that served as Thexani's temporary headquarters. The former Supreme Commander looked older, his scales showing the stress patterns that indicated deep psychological change in his species. Dr. Singh, he began, his voice carrying none of the military authority she remembered from their previous encounters. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know that after what we did to your people, you have every reason to refuse. Singh studied him carefully. The psychological profiles her team had developed indicated that Thexani was experiencing something analogous to post-traumatic stress triggered by the empathy induction he had undergone during the final battle. What did you want to show me? She asked directly. Thexani activated a holographic display showing what appeared to be architectural plans. This is the design for the Compassion Memorial Medical Complex. We're building it on Kethra Prime, at the site where your people first demonstrated their capabilities. Singh examined the plans with growing amazement. The complex was massive, a full medical university and research hospital capable of training thousands of medical personnel from dozens of species. The Confederation is dedicating 40% of our military budget to this project, Thexani explained. We're also establishing a fund to support medical training for any species that wants to participate. Why? Singh asked. Thexani was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant. Because during the final battle, when your people made me feel what Dr. Chen felt as she died, I understood something I had never grasped before. Medical personnel aren't just healers. They're the guardians of our collective humanity, regardless of species. He looked directly at Singh, his large eyes showing an emotion that his species rarely displayed. Genuine remorse. We didn't just attack your people, we attacked the very concept of mercy itself. And when you responded, you could have destroyed us completely. Instead, you chose to demonstrate what medical knowledge could accomplish while still refusing to abandon your principles entirely. Singh felt a complex mix of emotions. The man before her had ordered the deaths of over 3,000 medical personnel, had authorized attacks on hospital ships, had violated the most fundamental laws of civilized warfare. But he had also been fundamentally changed by experiencing the consequences of those decisions. The memorial complex is impressive, she said carefully. But what about the future? How do we ensure that something like this never happens again? Thexani gestured to another part of the holographic display. This is the other part of our proposal. Every Zelani child, starting at age 5, will receive mandatory education about medical neutrality and the role of healers in society. Every military officer will be required to spend a minimum of 1 year working in medical support roles before they can receive combat assignments. He paused, then continued. And every year, on the anniversary of the Compassion's destruction, we will observe a day of remembrance, not just for the medical personnel who died, but for the principles they represented. The Zelani weren't just offering reparations, they were fundamentally restructuring their society around respect for medical neutrality. There's one more thing, Texani said quietly. I know that you and the other human medical personnel have been debating whether to return to purely medical roles or to continue developing defensive capabilities. I wanted you to know that whatever you decide, the Confederation will support. Singh raised an eyebrow. Support how? If you choose to return to purely healing roles, we will help fund and protect your medical facilities. If you choose to maintain your defensive capabilities, we will provide intelligence and support to help you protect medical personnel throughout the galaxy. It was an extraordinary offer, and Singh understood the implications. The Zelani weren't just surrendering, they were offering to become allies in protecting the very principles they had violated. Later that evening, Singh met with the other leaders of what had become known as the Human Medical Defense Corps. Dr. Michael Torres, the trauma surgeon who had led the assault on Kethra Prime, was there along with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Dr. Marcus Reed, and dozens of others who had made the transition from healer to warrior and were now contemplating the transition back. The question before us is simple, Singh began. Do we return to being purely medical personnel or do we maintain the capabilities we've developed? The debate that followed was intense and emotional. Many of the medical personnel wanted to return to their original calling, to put the weapons and tactics they had developed behind them. Others argued that the galaxy was now safer precisely because potential attackers knew what human medical personnel were capable of when threatened. Dr. Torres spoke for many when he said, "I became a doctor to save lives. Everything we did during the war was about protecting our ability to save lives. But I don't want to be a weapon. I want to be a healer." Dr. Walsh disagreed. The only reason medical neutrality is being respected now is because everyone knows what happens when it's not. If we give up our defensive capabilities, we're back to relying on the good faith of others. The debate continued for hours, touching on philosophy, ethics, practical considerations, and the fundamental question of what it meant to be a healer in a universe that had seen healers become warriors. Finally, Singh called for quiet. "Maybe we don't have to choose," she said. "Maybe the answer is both." She activated a holographic display showing her own proposal, a restructuring of human medical services that would maintain both purely medical personnel and a specialized medical defense corps trained in both healing and protection. Medical personnel who want to focus entirely on healing would serve in protected facilities with their safety guaranteed by the Defense Corps. Those who want to maintain dual capabilities would serve in the Defense Corps, ready to respond to any future threats to medical neutrality. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered something for everyone. The galaxy would know that human medical personnel remained capable of defending themselves, but the majority of human healers could return to their original calling without the burden of military training. The vote was close, but Singh's proposal was approved. Over the following months, the new structure was implemented across human space. Medical schools began offering specialized tracks for those who wanted to serve in the Defense Corps, while traditional medical personnel were assigned to facilities protected by the new protocols. The psychological impact on the galaxy was profound. Medical neutrality, which had been more of a hopeful ideal than an enforced reality, became the most strictly observed law in interstellar space. No species wanted to face what the Zilani had experienced, but perhaps more importantly, the concept of healers as protectors had taken root across the galaxy. Medical personnel from dozens of species began training in defensive techniques, not to become warriors, but to ensure they could continue healing regardless of the circumstances they faced. A year after the destruction of the Compassion, Dr. Amanda Singh stood once again in the memorial garden aboard the Sarah Chen Memorial Hospital. But this time, she wasn't alone. The garden was filled with medical personnel from dozens of species, all gathered for the first annual Medical Neutrality Day. Dr. Keth Sarah was there, along with many of her Zilani colleagues. Admiral Kane, now director of the Galactic Medical Protection Corps, was addressing the crowd about the importance of protecting healers. Even Texani was present, representing the Zilani Confederation's commitment to medical neutrality. But it was the young faces that gave Singh the most hope, human and alien medical students who had grown up in a universe where medical neutrality was protected by more than just good intentions. They would never know a time when healers were considered vulnerable targets. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Singh found herself approached by a young human medical student she didn't recognize. "Dr. Singh," the student said nervously, "I'm Jennifer Chen. Dr. Sarah Chen was my aunt." Singh felt her breath catch. She looked more closely at the young woman and could see the resemblance, the same determined eyes, the same gentle confidence that had made Sarah Chen such an exceptional healer. "She would be proud of you," Jennifer continued, "not just for what you did during the war, but for how you've handled the peace. You've made sure that what happened to her can never happen again." Singh felt tears welling up in her eyes. "What are you planning to study?" "Emergency medicine," Jennifer replied without hesitation. "I want to be ready to help people in the worst situations they'll ever face. And if those situations involve threats to medical personnel?" Jennifer's expression grew serious, showing a maturity beyond her years. "Then I'll be ready for that too. Aunt Sarah taught me that healers have to be strong enough to protect their ability to heal." As Singh watched the young woman walk away, she realized that this was Dr. Sarah Chen's true legacy. Not the war that had been fought in her name, not the protocols that had been established to prevent future attacks, but the understanding that healing required both compassion and strength. The Zilani had crossed a line that should never be crossed. They had learned what existed on the other side of that line. But more importantly, the galaxy had learned that some principles were worth defending with everything they had. Medical personnel were healers first and always. But they were also the guardians of mercy itself, and they would never again be defenseless against those who mistook compassion for weakness. In the depths of space, new medical ships were being launched with both healing bays and defensive capabilities. On worlds across the galaxy, medical schools were teaching both anatomy and protection, and in the quiet moments between crises, healers continued to practice the most important lesson of all, that saving lives was worth any sacrifice, including the sacrifice of innocence itself. Sarah Chen's final message continued to echo across the stars. "Remember us not for how we died, but for how we lived." The galaxy had learned to do both. They remembered the deaths of the medical personnel aboard the Compassion, and they had built a universe where such deaths could never happen again. And they remembered how those healers had lived, with courage, with compassion, and with the unshakable belief that some things were worth protecting above all else. The healing had begun.